Today's talk is going to be something different. I'm going to share with you a story I've never told before. And that story is how Joseph Campbell and the book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, actually started the lean startup movement. And how many of you are familiar with Joseph Campbell? Maybe just this half of the room, right? And how many of you are familiar with the lean startup at all? Or maybe this half of the room. We should get you to meet in the middle. But for those of you who don't know, Joseph Campbell in 1949, he was a professor of literature for about 4 decades at Sarah Lawrence, read hundreds of myths and came to the observation that the hero myth in multiple cultures was essentially the same story, that a hero is called to an adventure, they turn down the adventure, some tragedy happens, and the hero then decides to accept the calling, puts together a series of companions to go on this quest, and in the quest undergoes physical and spiritual trials until just about to reach the goal. They face a physical and/or spiritual death and rebirth. And then they reach the goal, and then they bring whatever that goal was to their fellow man. And it's interesting because Campbell noticed that this was the story of Christ. It was the story of Moses. It was the story of Buddha. It was the story of Jason and the Argonauts. And what was really interesting was that it was a story that was there in front of all of us, but it was only Campbell who realized there was a pattern in all the data. And I tell you this because of the following story. I retired as a serial entrepreneur about 14 years ago, and I had done 8 startups in 21 years, all of them, vaguely interesting. But my career was essentially focused heads down. I was focused on execution and had no time for looking for patterns or strategies or anything else until I retired. And, I had no idea what I would do next. I took up golf. I was probably the only guy to injure himself, playing golf. I decided that wasn't for me. And I had no idea what I would do next, but I'd always lived with the ideas that for entrepreneurs, their best days are ahead of them rather than behind them. And I kind of lived that and said, I'll figure it out. And so what I decided the world really needed at the time were my memoirs. This is where you're supposed to laugh, because now in hindsight, I thought it was pretty funny as well, because it actually turned out to be just a catharsis of me talking about 21 years of lessons learned. And by this time, I was sitting on boards, had done a ton of private investments, I was an advisor of some other companies, and hadn't seen as many deals as venture capitalists, but I sure saw a lot of deals for an entrepreneur. And what I noticed is as I was typing my story and thinking about all the other entrepreneurs I had met, is that there was a pattern emerging. And it was a pattern that no one else had ever seen. Meaning we'd all seen it, but no one else had ever called it. And the pattern is that for the last century, we had been treating entrepreneurs like they were smaller versions of large companies. Is that every investor had told every entrepreneur, the way you do a startup is you write a business plan, and if we like it, we fund it, and then you write the income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow, and you execute to that plan, and then we collect the money at the end. And that's how it will work. And by the way, if there's any difficulties, it's because you screwed it up. It's a big idea. That's, in fact, up to the end of the last century, that is to 1999, that's how we thought of startups. And the more I started writing, I realized that much like Campbell and the hero's journey, that there was actually a pattern that hadn't been articulated. And it went like this. First of all, the first observation I had made as an entrepreneur is no business plan survives first contact with customers. And B is that the only people who required 5-year plans on a series of unknowns were the Soviet Union and venture capitalists, with the same results. And then the more I started thinking about the difference between success and failure is that it turns out that unlike the venture capitalist stories, successful entrepreneurs actually went from failure to failure, not from success to success, but learning as rapidly as they could. And this was a big idea, that failure was an integral part of the entrepreneurship experience, and that learning from failure was the critical piece. In fact, in the past, the way we learned from failure, the venture capital model is you would build a product, do alpha test, beta test, first customer ship. Anybody remember that? Right? Launch the product, try to sell the product. Product doesn't meet quite expectations. The first couple board meetings, the VP of sales would say, when asked how we doing per plan, she would say, great pipeline. And for those of you not in sales, that's another point where you're supposed to laugh, because it means, like it doesn't quite match the plan. But she'll keep saying this for another couple board meetings until one day, and I don't know how the VCs did this, you'd open the room or the boardroom, and all of a sudden no one is sitting next to the VP of sales because the stench of death is there, and they have brought in a flaming sword over her head, and the minute she says pipeline, poof, she would disappear, and a new VP of sales would show up. But what was really interesting was not that process, it was what would happen next. The new VP of sales would say, well, that was a dumb strategy. Here's the strategy we should do. What we never understood is what we just did was something called a pivot. What we would do is change strategy by firing executives, never quite understanding that perhaps we shouldn't be firing the people first, that perhaps we should be firing the plan first. It's a huge concept. The other observation I made over time was what we were doing on day one as entrepreneurs with our vision and our passion and our energy is all we had is a set of untested hypotheses, which we could articulate passionately because we were great entrepreneurs. And we could create a reality distortion field that, parted people with their money and their jobs and their buildings and, customers would, but it was still a series of untested hypotheses. And as I reminded my Stanford students, I let them use the word hypotheses because inside of Stanford, they're paying $50,000 a year. But outside of Stanford, hypotheses really mean guesses. And so what we really had on day one for almost every startup was a faith-based enterprise with a series of untested guesses. And we had no processes to test those guesses. And that turned into two other observations. One is there were no facts inside your building, so get the hell outside. And the reason you're going to do that is while you might be the smartest people in your building and you could win all the arguments, there is no way that you're smarter than the collective intelligence of your potential customers. Big idea. And so I started putting these ideas together and wrote a book in about 2003 called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And that kicked off what essentially was a career in education. I showed up at Berkeley at Haas as a guest speaker. And then my traditional MO was, volunteer for everything, and I kept showing up, and I kept showing up, and then one day they said, well, why don't you guest teach a class? And then I said, well, I'd really like to write a class, and they laughed hysterically, and then one day they said, well, why don't you go ahead and write this customer development class? And so I was teaching these principles of customer development, and then one day I had a ex-VP of engineering who wanted to start his 4th company. I had lost money on his first 3. But this time he had a new co-founder, a young engineer named Eric Rees. And I said, well, only on the condition that you and Eric take the class. And my VP of engineering was grumbling the whole class. It's a stupid idea. No one's ever going to do this stuff. This customer development idea is a bad idea. Meanwhile, Eric was driving back home and actually building this company called IMVU and became the first practitioner of customer development and paired it with something called agile engineering, which for those of you who know, in the 21st century, we no longer build products with alpha, beta, first customer ship because they assume that we know all the possible features that customers could want on day one. What we really want to do now is build the products incrementally and iteratively so we can actually learn by building what are called minimum viable products and getting feedback as fast as we can. And so Eric invented the agile and customer development combination. I continued to teach the class. I then taught it at Stanford, and this time I discovered the work of someone named Alexander Osterwalder. Anybody ever use or see the business model canvas? For the first time, this guy named Osterwalder managed to take a 20-year topic, this word called business model, which usually required 423 pages to describe, and he put it in a single diagram. And Osterwalder said, look, we could describe all the things you need to know as a business in 9 boxes. What are you building? Value proposition. Who are you building it for? Customer segments. How are you going to get, keep, and grow customers? What's your channel? How are you going to make money? What are the costs? Who are your partners? Do you need to do any special activities or need any special resources? Those 9 things make up a business model. And I decided that, in fact, the business model canvas from Osterwalder was the best way to kind of frame. The answer to the question is, what is it that startups need to test and answer to build their business? And that the customer development process, the ability to get out of the building, was the way to test it, and agile engineering was the way to build it. And to make a long story short is, I got invited to teach the same class at Stanford. We started this lean startup class called the Innovation Core at Stanford, and then eventually taught the same class in Columbia. But this is where life gets a little interesting. When I first taught the class at Stanford, I put all the pieces together. It changed from a lecture class into an experiential class. What we made our students do is come into the class with an idea, present their business model canvas, and then every week get out and talk to 10 to 15 customers a week and come back and present. Present what they learned, present what customers thought, present whether their people wanted their minimum viable product or not. Repeat for 10 weeks. In one class, students will end up talking to 75 to 100 customers in a semester. Now, this was such a radical class, I blogged about it, thinking that maybe someone else would think it was interesting. And about 6 weeks after I started writing the blogs, I get a call from someone who said, hi, my name is Errol Arkelik. I'm from the US government. We need your help. Now, the last time I heard that, I ended up in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. And it cost me 4 years of my life. And so this time I said, well, the government got my help. You're not getting it again. He said, no, we're from the National Science Foundation. And, I hate to admit it, I said, what's the National Science Foundation? And for those who don't know, it's a $7 billion US government agency that funds essentially all science and engineering in academia except for medical in the US. And he said, we've been giving out essentially $500,000 grants to any scientists for the last 30 years who want to commercialize their science. And thank gosh that Congress has never actually asked, how are we doing? Because the results have been horrific. And I said, well, why are you calling me? He said, we want you to build a class for the government on how to actually commercialize all science in the US. And so I said, okay, I could fit you in next year. And he said, in 90 days. And I said, are you sure you're from the US government? He said, well, I used to be an entrepreneur. I said, I got it. So I kind of engaged a couple of friends who were venture capitalists. We put together a prototype class. And in 90 days, we taught 25 teams for the government, some of the best scientists in the country. And the results were spectacular. Fast forward, the National Science Foundation decides to standardize on this class to commercialize all science in the United States. It's now taught at 11 other universities, and we're teaching 400 teams a year. ARPA-E just adopted it, and this fall I'm going to be teaching the class at UCSF for life sciences as well. What's really interesting and a funny outcome of the class is the students were actually professors, principal investigators. And they went back to their schools, and about a quarter of them went back hating us because we made them work harder than they had since their PhD thesis. But about a third to half of them went back to their schools and said, how come we're not teaching this? And pretty soon we had demand from educators across the country and now across the world to actually have us teach the same process to their educators. And so through a nonprofit, we offer the Lean Launchpad class to 75 to 100 educators a quarter. And this process seems to work. I'll just close with some of the data. The National Science Foundation last month said, Steve, we thought you should know we're no longer allowing people to not take your class. I said, well, why? What happened? Well, the data we just got back said people who didn't have to take your class for the NSF, and it was still optional, we're getting funded by peer review about 18% of the time, and that's been consistent for the last 30 years. Well, why are we having this call? Well, the people who have taken the class, the data says they get funded 60% of the time. I said, well, what did you do? They said, well, we thought it was unethical to continue the experiment, and now everybody who applies for what's called an SBIR grant has to go through the process. So we've managed to change in the last decade or so how entrepreneurs think about startups. I think the lean startup movement has made a dent in entrepreneurship, in education, and now how we commercialize science. And I think we have Joseph Campbell to blame for that. So thank you very much.